There are bands that have great songs, there are bands that have great albums, and then there are bands that somehow become part of the culture itself. The Rolling Stones did exactly that. For more than 60 years, they've survived changing musical tastes, changing lineups, changing decades, and somehow they've always managed to sound like the Rolling Stones. But here's something I've always wondered. If you had to introduce someone to the Rolling Stones with just 5 songs, which 5 would you choose? Would you pick the biggest hits, the best guitar riffs, the greatest live performances? Or would you choose the songs that completely changed the direction of rock music? Because today, we're not counting down the biggest sellers. We're diving into 5 songs that built the legend. 5 songs with incredible stories behind them. Stories involving dreams, studio accidents, arguments, controversy. One of the greatest female vocal performances ever recorded. And one song that nearly wasn't released because Keith Richards didn't even think it was good enough. Before we get started, I want to know something. When someone says the Rolling Stones, what's the very first song that pops into your head? Don't overthink it. Whatever came into your mind first, drop it in the comments. I'm curious how many different answers we'll get, because I have a feeling this list is going to spark a few debates. Let's start with the song that changed everything. I honestly don't think there has ever been a more famous guitar riff that almost got thrown away. Think about that. One of the most recognizable riffs in music history, almost forgotten before breakfast. May 1965. Keith Richards is asleep in a hotel room while the Stones are touring in Florida. Like a lot of musicians, he keeps a small cassette recorder beside his bed. Not because he plans on writing music at 3 in the morning, but because ideas don't exactly ask permission before they show up. Sometime during the night, Keith wakes up, half asleep, barely conscious. He grabs the guitar, plays a riff into the recorder, mumbles a few words, drops the guitar, falls back asleep. The next morning, he rewinds the tape. There's about 30 seconds of guitar, followed by nearly 40 minutes of him snoring. Can you imagine almost losing one of the greatest riffs ever written because you rolled over and went back to sleep? And here's another question. How many incredible songs do you think have been forgotten forever? Simply because the songwriter didn't have a recorder nearby? Makes you wonder. Now here's something a lot of people don't realize. Keith never intended for that riff to stay on the record. In fact, he imagined it being played by a horn section. Listen to the riff for a second in your mind. Now imagine trumpets playing it. Sounds strange, doesn't it? But that's exactly what Keith had in mind. The fuzz guitar? That wasn't supposed to be permanent. It was basically a placeholder. The Maestro FZ1 fuzz pedal had only been on the market for a short time. Keith plugged into it simply to demonstrate what the horns would eventually play. Then something funny happened. Everybody heard the demo and loved the guitar. Sometimes the temporary version becomes the masterpiece. Now let me ask you this. Have you ever accidentally done something better than what you originally planned? Because that's exactly what happened here. The mistake became history. Now let's talk about Mick Jagger's lyrics. Most people think Satisfaction is just another rock song about frustration. It is, but it's also much smarter than that. Remember what was happening in 1965. Television advertising is exploding. Consumer culture is exploding. Everything is telling people what they need to buy, how they should look, how they should live. Mick later explained that Satisfaction wasn't just about romance. It was about modern life, commercialism, pressure, advertising, trying to find fulfillment in a world constantly telling you you're incomplete. Pretty interesting, because honestly, that song feels even more relevant today. Think about social media, algorithms, influencers, ads following you around the internet. Would Satisfaction sound out of place if it were written today? I don't think so. That's one reason great songs survive. They're about something bigger than their own time. Now here's another incredible story. When the band finished recording it, their manager wasn't convinced. Keith wasn't convinced. Several people thought it would simply be another album track, not a hit. Certainly not the song that would define a career. How many times have we seen that happen? Artists spend weeks chasing the song they think will be the hit, only for something almost accidental to become the classic. Satisfaction hits #1, then another country, then another, and suddenly, the Rolling Stones aren't simply Britain's second biggest band. They're global stars. One riff, one recording session, one happy accident. History changes. Now here's the question I want you to answer. Is Satisfaction the greatest guitar riff ever written? Or is there another riff that deserves that crown? Now let's change the mood completely. Because if satisfaction is swagger, Paint It Black is darkness. Have you ever noticed how unsettling this song feels? Even before Mick starts singing, something about it feels different. That's because it was. Rock music in 1966 wasn't supposed to sound like this. Most bands were still writing straightforward guitar songs. Then Brian Jones walks into the studio carrying something most rock fans had barely seen before, a sitar. Now think about this. The Beatles were experimenting with Indian music around the same time. George Harrison had already begun exploring the instrument, but Brian Jones wasn't trying to copy anyone. He was looking for sounds that didn't exist in traditional rock. And suddenly, Paint It Black doesn't sound British anymore. It doesn't sound American. It sounds timeless. The sitar immediately creates tension, mystery, unease. It's one of those moments where one instrument completely changes the emotional personality of a song. Have you ever heard a single instrument instantly transport you somewhere else? That's exactly what the sitar does here. But here's the interesting part. A lot of people assume Paint It Black was written about war, Vietnam, death, loss. And honestly, it's easy to understand why. For decades, the song has appeared in war movies, documentaries, television. It became emotionally connected with Vietnam. But here's the catch. The song was released before it became deeply associated with those images. Mick Jagger has generally described it as a song about overwhelming grief, about somebody who has experienced such profound loss. They want the entire world to lose its color. Now stop for a second. Read those lyrics again sometime. They're darker than people remember. This isn't teenage heartbreak. This is somebody trying to erase joy itself. That's heavy, especially for a pop song in 1966. Now here's something else people forget. Brian Jones's contribution wasn't just the sitar. Throughout those early years, Brian was the stone constantly searching for unusual instruments. Marimba, dulcimer, recorder, anything that could push the band's sound into new territory. Sometimes he doesn't get enough credit for that curiosity. And honestly, without Brian Jones, the Stones might have sounded very different during the mid. Now here's a question for you. Do bands become legendary because they write great songs? Or because they're willing to take risks before everybody else? Because Paint It Black was absolutely a risk. The record company could easily have said, "This is too strange. Radio won't play it. People won't understand it." Instead, it goes to #1, again. And suddenly, the Rolling Stones prove they aren't just a blues band anymore. They can be experimental. They can be mysterious. They can be cinematic. And that's an important word, cinematic, because even today, close your eyes while Paint It Black plays. Don't you immediately see images? That's what great music does. It creates pictures, not just sounds. Now let me ask one last question before we move on. If Brian Jones had stayed healthy and remained with the Stones through the 1970s, how different do you think their music would have been? Would they have become even more experimental? Or did the band evolve exactly the way it was supposed to? That's one of rock's great what-ifs. If there is one Rolling Stones song that sounds like the world is ending, it's Gimme Shelter. Not because it's loud, not because it's fast, because it feels real. Even today, more than 50 years later, that opening guitar sends a chill down your spine. And here's something I want you to think about. Have you ever heard the first 5 seconds of a song and instantly known something incredible was about to happen? That's Gimme Shelter. Keith Richards later said he wrote the opening riff while sitting at home looking out a window during a storm. Rain pounding outside, thunder rolling, dark clouds everywhere. He once described watching the weather move in and thinking about everything happening in the world. And honestly, 1969, the Vietnam War, political assassinations, civil unrest, protests, cities burning, the optimism of the summer of love was fading fast. Rock music was growing up, and so were the Rolling Stones. Now here's something interesting. People often assume Mick Jagger wrote the entire message behind Gimme Shelter. But Keith's guitar created the atmosphere long before the lyrics were finished. That opening doesn't just introduce a song, it introduces anxiety. You don't hear it, you feel it. Now let me ask you something. Can one guitar riff create fear? Because I think this one does. Before Mick even opens his mouth, you already know this isn't going to be another love song. Then comes one of the greatest recording sessions in rock history. Mary Clayton. If you've never heard her name, you're about to wonder why. Picture this. It's late at night. Mary Clayton is asleep, pregnant, already in bed. She gets a phone call. The Rolling Stones need someone immediately. Can you come to the studio? She throws on a coat over her pajamas, heads to the studio, walks up to the microphone, and sings one of the greatest vocal performances ever recorded. Now here's where the story becomes unbelievable. When she reaches the line, rape, murder, her voice cracks. Not because she missed the note, because she pushed so hard that her voice literally broke. That crack stayed on the record. Think about that. Most producers would have stopped the tape, done another take, tried to make it cleaner. Instead, they kept it, because perfection wasn't the point, emotion was. Now here's something that still amazes me. Listen carefully after that vocal crack. You can actually hear people in the control room reacting. They're stunned. Keith Richards later admitted everyone just looked at each other. They knew something extraordinary had happened. And here's the heartbreaking part. Not long after the session, Mary Clayton suffered a miscarriage. For years, people connected the two events, but Clayton herself later rejected the idea that the recording caused it. Still, the story adds another layer to a performance that already feels emotionally overwhelming. Now let me ask you this. What makes a legendary vocal? Perfect technique? Or the willingness to give everything you've got, even if your voice breaks in the process? Because I know which one I remember. Now here's another twist. For years, people couldn't decide whose song this really was. Keith's riff, Mick's lyrics, Mary Clayton's unforgettable vocal. Maybe that's exactly why it works. It's one of those rare songs where every person involved delivered the performance of their lives. Then something happened that forever changed the way people heard Gimme Shelter. Altamont, December 1969. The Rolling Stones organize a free concert in California. It was supposed to be America's answer to Woodstock. Instead, it becomes one of rock's darkest days. Violence erupts. A young man named Meredith Hunter is killed in front of the stage. Suddenly, Gimme Shelter doesn't just sound ominous. It sounds prophetic. Do you think songs change meaning because of history? Or do we simply hear them differently afterward? Because I don't think anybody listens to Gimme Shelter the same way they did before Altamont. Now let's talk about the song that convinced thousands of people the Rolling Stones were worshiping Satan, which, of course, they weren't. But that didn't stop the rumors. Here's what's fascinating. Sympathy for the Devil didn't even start as a rock song. When Mick Jagger first began writing it, it was slower, almost folk music, inspired in part by Mikhail Bulgakov's novel The Master and Margarita. If you've never read it, it's one of the strangest novels ever written. The devil visits Moscow, not simply to create chaos, but to expose human hypocrisy. And that's exactly what fascinated Mick. Now here's the question. What if the devil isn't the hero, but the narrator? That's the genius of the song. The devil isn't asking you to admire him. He's asking you to recognize how often human beings create their own disasters. Listen to the lyrics. Wars, assassinations, violence, revolutions. The devil keeps showing up, but he's never forcing anyone to do anything. He's simply observing. That's a very different idea than people first assumed. Now here's where things become really interesting. During the recording sessions, the song wasn't working at all. The band keeps trying. Different arrangements, different tempos. Nothing clicks. Then Charlie Watts starts playing a samba rhythm. Everything changes. Seriously. One rhythmic decision transforms the entire record. Can you imagine if Charlie had played a standard rock beat instead? Would the song even be memorable? Sometimes, history changes because one musician plays something unexpected. And then there's Keith Richards. Listen to his guitar carefully. It's not overwhelming. It's conversational, almost answering Mick's vocal. And the percussion, the woo-woo background vocals, they make the listener part of the performance. Go ahead, be honest. Have you ever found yourself singing those background vocals? Everybody does. And that's brilliant songwriting. Of course, the controversy begins immediately. Church groups protest. Parents panic. Newspapers accuse the Stones of promoting evil. Sound familiar? Rock music has been scaring parents for decades. Now here's what I always ask people. Do you think audiences actually listen to the lyrics? Or just reacted to the title? Because if you really hear what Mick is saying, the song isn't glorifying evil. It's asking uncomfortable questions about humanity. That's a big difference. Now let's slow things down, because after all that darkness, the Stones give us one of the greatest ballads ever written. Angie, And here's the mystery. Who was Angie? Seriously, people have debated this for more than 50 years. Angela Bowie? Keith Richards' daughter, Angela? Someone else entirely? Keith has insisted the name simply arrived while he was writing. Others disagree. The rumors have never stopped. Now let me ask you something. Do you enjoy knowing exactly who inspired a song? Or do you like the mystery better? Because honestly, I think the mystery helped make Angie timeless. If we'd gotten one simple answer, the conversation probably would have ended decades ago. Instead, people still debate it. Now let's talk about the recording. One thing I love about Angie is how restrained it is. No giant guitar solos. No wall of sound. No attempt to overpower the listener. Just emotion. Keith's acoustic guitar. Mick's vulnerable vocal. Simple piano. Sometimes, less really is more. And that's something the Stones understood better than almost anybody. Now here's something people often overlook. The Stones had already built a reputation as rock's bad boys. Swagger, attitude, danger. Then they released one of the most emotionally vulnerable songs of their career. Why? Because great bands don't stay in one lane. They surprise you. They refuse to become predictable. That's why they've survived. Now let me ask you something. If someone had never heard the Rolling Stones before, would you play them Satisfaction first? Or Angie? Which song tells the better story about who this band really was? When you step back, something becomes obvious. These weren't just hit songs. They were turning points. Satisfaction proved rock riffs could become cultural landmarks. Paint It Black proved the Stones weren't afraid to experiment. Gimme Shelter showed rock music could capture fear itself. Sympathy for the Devil challenged audiences to think instead of react. Angie reminded everyone that beneath all the swagger, there was vulnerability. And isn't that why the Rolling Stones still matter? Because they weren't one-dimensional. One week they sounded dangerous. The next week they sounded heartbroken. One album embraced the blues. The next explored country. Then gospel. Then disco. Then hard rock. Every decade, they adapted, without ever sounding like anybody else. That's incredibly difficult. Most bands spend their careers chasing trends. The Stones somehow managed to survive them. Now let's end where we began. I asked you earlier, what's the first Rolling Stones song that comes to mind? Has it changed? Or are you still thinking about the same one? Maybe it's Jumpin' Jack Flash. Maybe it's Start Me Up. Maybe it's Brown Sugar. Maybe it's one we didn't even mention today. That's the amazing thing about this band. There isn't one correct answer. There are dozens. And that's exactly what separates legendary bands from great ones. Legendary bands don't have one defining song. They have an entire soundtrack. So now I want to hear from you. Which Rolling Stones song do you think should have made this list? Which one tells the greatest story? Which one changed rock music forever? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're just here to spend some time with one of the greatest rock bands ever assembled, relax and spark one up and keep that turntable spinning.